Welcome back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, June 29, 2017. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani back inside our brand new New York City studio. We are rolling 3 deep this week with a little twist. First off, that is the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of the Washington Post. And let's say hello once again to the returning Colombian kid, Danny Segura of MMAfighting.com. He's back.
Gracias, yeah, I'm back.
Still sporting the mustache. I like that. What do you think of our new digs?
It's really nice. I like it a lot, yeah.
Well, it's great. We said we only wanted to bring you back once we renovated the place.
Yeah. Let's renovate the place, let's bring him back. Perfect scenario to come back.
Well, welcome back. We missed you. It's good to have you here. Of course, Chuck and Luke are off this week, but we are still rolling along because there's a lot to discuss. And let us start off this week with UFC 214. It's funny, UFC 213 is next weekend, but I think it's safe to say that 214 is way more talked about, way more interesting, way more stacked. It's got a ton more interesting fights, in my opinion. Do you guys agree with this? I mean, 214 feels like it was supposed to be the 213 card.
Yeah, well, 3 title fights now.
Yeah.
And, they really are stacking. I wonder if they're just not trusting Jon Jones because, Dana White did famously say that I will never, ever make Jon Jones the main event of a pay-per-view. Well, he did go back on that. But he seems to be kind of ensuring himself by making sure that there are 2 title fights below his fight. So, it's an embarrassment of riches. It's an excellent fight card.
And it's crazy that it's being talked about more than 213 because 213 also has 2 title fights.
Yes.
So, it's still a pretty stacked card. So
One is an interim title fight.
Yeah, still though.
Kind of feels like the unofficial. Yeah. So let me ask you about 214 because in the last 48 hours, 2 title fights were added. One was changed. One was added. Last night, Tyron Woodley versus Demian Maia for the welterweight title was added. 2 nights ago, they announced that Megan Anderson is out of the Chris Cyborg fight for the vacant featherweight title, and it's now Chris Cyborg versus Tanya Evinger, a sort of Invicta super fight, if you will, because Tanya Evinger was the bantamweight champion. Let me first ask you about the Tyron Woodley-Demian Maia fight. I was surprised that they booked this for a couple of reasons. The first one is it's very rare that they actually do 3 title fights on a card. They did it recently for MSG. They did it way back when. I believe it was UFC 33. But historically, they don't like to do 3 title fights. So, A, do you share my surprise? Do you think that it's kind of unnecessary to have 3 titles? As great as it is, great for the fans, great for the pay-per-view buying audience, 3 title fights, but also to essentially give Demian Maia 1 month to prepare for Tyron Woodley. Does that kind of feel like it's a little unfair for Maia?
I think so. It's 100% unfair. This is the guy that has done everything the UFC has asked him to do, and he should have been fighting for the title a couple fights ago. And yet, he's fighting a very dangerous opponent, obviously the champion. And, he's been training for a while. He's been preparing for Demian Maia for a while. Yeah, Woodley. So, Demian Maia giving him a month after, all of that he's done, I think it's very unfair.
I mean, I guess the timing is unfortunate, but I'm just thinking Demian Maia has been also preparing for the opportunity that has been laid out in front of him. I mean, he earned this opportunity a long time ago, and then he went out and fought Jorge Masvidal really unnecessarily, really. He didn't need to do that fight in order to earn this title shot, but he did it anyway, and he won that fight. It seems to me that as soon as that thing was over, he knew that his time was coming. Now, yes, he only has 1 month to prepare for the intricacies of the Tyron Woodley game, but that he's been preparing for a long time. We also know exactly what Demian Maia is going to do when he gets in there. And so I'm going to look at it more of the glass half full instead of the glass half empty. I'm going to say that this is a fight that is a long time in coming. It should have been booked. This is the way the UFC should be booking title fights. The champion against the #1 contender. None of this other nonsense except for an occasional exception. This is the way it should be. Yeah, the timing isn't perfect, but it's a fight that I'm really looking forward to seeing.
So when the fight was announced, you'll always have some people who are like, I don't like this fight. Maia has somewhat of a polarizing style, although I can't honestly for the life of me understand why someone wouldn't appreciate his style. There's something for everyone in the UFC, and he has a very dominant style. Do you like this matchup? This is a fight that I've actually been wanting to see dating back, a couple of years now, before Woodley was champion, before Maia was the #1 contender. Just the style matchup of the grappler going up against the wrestler who's turned into quite the striker. Do you like this matchup, or do you feel like the fans who are saying, oh, it has the potential to be a boring one, there's something to that as well. They're onto something.
There's something to that as well. It has the potential to be a boring fight, but just the styles and to see what's going to happen, that's very interesting. And, Woodley fights off, his back real close to the cage. So, and Demian Maia always trying to, get his opponent's back. So that's going to be very interesting. And just the styles to see if he can actually get Woodley to the ground. Yeah, I'm very interested in that.
Here's Woodley, who in his last fight, actually his last two fights, fought against arguably the best stand-up fighter in the game, right? Wonderboy Thompson. That was a fight where he was thought to be kind of out of his element in terms of the stand-up, and he did pretty well. He did well enough to win the last one and have a draw the first time. Now he's going against a guy who is arguably the best ground fighter in there. So and I guess you could also say he's overmatched on the ground in a sense, at least on paper. You would expect that to be the case. So I kind of like the fact that Woodley is being challenged both in two elements of the game by specialists, and we're going to now get a chance to see him do something completely different. I do think there is that possibility though that his superb wrestling will nullify Maia's ability to take the fight to the mat. But you know what? Maia's been doing this against wrestlers before. This is not the first time he's fought somebody who had good takedown defense. And and Woodley's also like the kind of guy that he might just say, hey, we're going to go on the ground, we're going to tussle, and I'm going to be the one that's going to come out on top.
Amazingly, July 29th is 364 days since Woodley won the belt against Robbie Lawler, and what a year it has been for him. At the beginning, it felt like he was going to be this much maligned champion, but then he wins the belt against Robbie Lawler on July 30th. Then he comes back at MSG of all cards, the Conor card, pay-per-view points. Then he gets the rematch against Wonderboy. Now he's fighting on this card, the John Jones card, and it seems like they are setting up the winner of this fight to fight GSP. At least that's what they want. I still do believe that Bisping and GSP want to fight each other, and so Dana White is putting out in the media that that's what he wants, but both those guys are still not on board. Still, if the stars align for Tyron Woodley, holy smokes, what a year for the guy, right? I mean, starting off when people are kind of like, we don't really care about this champion, the guy has a knack for putting himself in big fights on big cards.
And again, I would say that would be an upgrade over. I know you've been a proponent of GSP versus Bisping. To me, that was a fight that
because they offered it.
Okay, yeah, but it wasn't a fight that made much sense. This is a fight that would make more sense. I realize that GSP has been off for an extended period, but before he left the sport, he was the reigning champion at 170. Yeah. That's Woodley's weight class. So it would be Woodley defending against a guy who never lost the belt. That would make sense to me. If in fact, and if it's Maia, that also becomes an interesting, matchup with GSP. So I think that's the right way of doing it. If they're going to trying to handle GSP's comeback, to me, that's the way it should have gone all along.
I think it would be insane the year that he would have, obviously, if he were to get past Demian Maia and then fight GSP. But I agree with Jeff. I like that fight more than the Bisping one. I know they offered it, and that's why, maybe he should, GSP get, a crack at Bisping. But, I mean, really, the division, GSP left the division as a king. And I would like to kind of compare it as the John Jones-Daniel Cormier situation in the sense of, like, some people feel like Daniel Cormier is not the real champion because, John Jones has been out. I feel like that's not exactly the case at welterweight, but you can make the case that, GSP could still be the greatest welterweight around. So it'd be kind of interesting to see, the current champion versus the longtime king. Who's the top dog? Let's see what happens.
And not only that, it would not just, create a reasonable and logical matchup at 170, but it also frees up the 185 weight class to get back to normal and have the champion fight against the #1 contender. What a concept, having a champion fight against the guy who's earned it. That's the way it should be going. I mean, I realize that there are times when the UFC and other promotions are going to want to do money fights and they're going to want to do little things outside the box. But it seems to me that they've tried to do that a little too much lately, and I think it's nice that they're at least veering in the direction of preserving these weight classes a little bit.
No doubt about it, 214, the best card of the year thus far. I mean, it's not even close. Let me ask you guys this. Which title fight do you like more? I'm just curious, because there's elements to both. Cyborg Evinger or Woodley Maia? Of the two new fights that were added, which one do you like better? Which one are you more intrigued by?
To be honest, I don't like the Cyborg Evinger too much. It feels like it's just
too rushed?
Yeah, it's not even too rushed. I mean, I want to see Cyborg fight a natural, good 145-pound.
But there aren't any.
Exactly. Well, I mean, Megan Anderson would have been
but if
it,
she's
but
unavailable.
obviously, yeah, unfortunate situations for her. She had to pull out. But you know, this is still a bantamweight fighting, you know, a much bigger opponent. And Evanger's game, you know, she's a champion, obviously for a reason. A veteran, has been around for a while. She's got an interesting style, but you know, it doesn't have that appeal. I really would have liked to see Megan Anderson versus Cyborg. And then, you know, obviously the Demian Maia, Tyron Woodley fight. It's been a long time coming. That's a great fight itself, but it can't top John Jones versus Daniel Cormier.
Right, and I'm not asking. That one is the fight of all fights this year.
100%.
But just between the two, do you share his sentiment about the Cyborg fight?
Yeah, I mean, nobody has shown themselves to be able to not just defeat Cyborg, but to even give her much of a fight. I mean, it's a little bit like when Rousey was just mowing down opponents in mere seconds. But of course, that all ended one night. And is that going to happen to Cyborg? I don't really see it. I think Cyborg is somebody who, I don't know, I just don't see somebody being able to find some weakness in her other than when she gets old and loses some of her reflexes, loses some of her ability. But I don't think she's there yet. So I don't really expect that fight to be anywhere near as competitive as the welterweight title fight. And I'm, you know, that Maia and Woodley, I mean, I like both those guys. I think they're both tremendous fighters, and I'm looking forward to that I'm looking forward to that as much as I'm looking forward to the main event. I really am, and because, you know, the one sort of X factor in that main event is John Jones having been out for a long time, but you know, I think that Daniel Cormier has a lot of ground to make up in order to make that a really hotly contested fight. Maybe he has, maybe John Jones has lost something, maybe that will be a great fight, but the one that I'm looking forward to is that Woodley-Maia fight. I think that's just dynamite.
I would like to add, though, the Avenger replacement is probably one of the better options, you know, the UFC had, and I think they made the right call, you know, obviously having Megan Anderson out.
Yeah.
I agree with you guys that it feels like it's been forever since Cyborg has fought a true 145er, good or bad. But it always feels like she's fighting someone who's fighting above her weight class, and then they have this built-in excuse, and then they go back to 135. So that's what was so appealing about the Megan Anderson fight. As you said, the Evanger replacement is a nice one because she's a fresh opponent. She's a fresh face. She's been in the sport for so long. She's somewhat of a pioneer. She's a great character. I noted on Twitter, I really hope that the UFC knows how to promote her and does a good job of promoting her, because she is somewhat of a sort of Diaz sister, if you will, an unofficial one. I mean, she marches to the beat of her own drum, doesn't care about the critics, doesn't care about being PC. And it sort of fits her personality that, yeah, she'll take this fight on a month's notice. This is her entry into the UFC. Why not? I'll take this fight against the person no one wants to fight, including the champion who said no thanks. Think about that. The 145 champ said no thanks, but the 135-pound champ in Invicta, who can't get in the UFC, said, yes, I'll take this fight if I have to.
I think when you put it in that context, and you look at how, you know, a champion was willing to be stripped of her belt in order to not fight Cyborg, and then you say, here's this woman who you know, is booked to fight somebody else and defend her belt over in Invicta, and now she gets the opportunity to fight Cyborg, and she just jumps at it without a hesitation. You know, yeah, I mean, I think that the Diaz comparison is right on. She's a badass, and that makes it so appealing. But you know, when we're comparing the other fights, I still think the other ones are better fights. But yeah, she's a game opponent.
She's a very interesting personality, and they have essentially 1 month, you know, to promote this fight. Of course, there's so much going on between now and then. We have 213 next week. We've got the tough finale. There's the Scotland card. There's Long Island, and that's kind of the shame in all of this. You only essentially have a week to promote these fights, right? I mean, how much promotion are we seeing right now for 213? A little, you know, tweets here or there, but nothing out of the ordinary. You're not seeing, you know, Amanda Nunes get a ton of. Maybe I'm wrong in the, you know, Hispanic, you know, market.
I mean,
nothing,
no, I don't
right?
think so. I've seen, you know, I follow Miami
Latin America.
I feel like they've been backing up MMA a little bit, but again, nothing major. There's no this huge campaign with like some big commercial going on. So yeah, it does suck that, you know, they don't have that much.
Well, they're just going week to week, right?
They're going week just
to week.
working with what they have.
11 fights or 11 fight cards in 11 weeks, although they do have an off week this week, but then they double it up next week, so it ends up being 11 and 11. So that's 214. That's coming up July 29th in Anaheim. Let's talk about last week. Let's stick with the UFC for a second. Sunday night, they had the card in Oklahoma City, Kevin Lee versus Michael Chiesa, and this felt going in like it could be a turning point in Kevin Lee's career because he had gained some momentum. Chiesa had been out for so long that I think he lost a little momentum. Had he won, he would have, I think, gone back on track. But this kind of felt like, okay, a potential showcase for Lee. They have the brawl or the punch at the press conference, and then he thoroughly dominates him, but kind of gets robbed of his clean victory. Looking back now, 4 days later, I think initially we all kind of felt like, gosh, if Mario Yamasaki just would have waited a couple seconds, like there would have been nothing you could say about Kevin Lee. Do we feel like it's still a little incomplete, or 4 days later, are we kind of moving past that?
I moved past it pretty quickly, really. I mean, I don't. To me, the story of that night was not Mario Yamasaki or Mario Mazzagatti, as Dana White called him. The story was the Motown phenom. I mean, he was just that was a spectacular performance. I knew that it was a dominant performance, but it was even amplified more when I look back at Chiesa's record. The guy has 14 wins. His last 8 finishes have all been by rear naked choke. So talk about, you beat a guy. You're not only just beating him, but you're beating him at his own game. That is really a spectacular thing, because that guy's, if he's in the gym working that all the time, he knows all the ways of escaping. And all I'll say about the refereeing and that is that Chiesa stopped hand fighting. And when he stopped hand fighting, that I think gave Yamasaki the moment where, and what is he always criticized for letting fights go on too long.
Yes.
So I think he got a little trigger happy, but he did it when the guy had stopped fighting the choke and was just lying there, basically
For like
being
a
choked.
Second though.
Right, exactly. But I'm not defending I'm not saying that he was right.
Sounds like
but I'm saying that he was. Well, I'm just saying that this was that once you stop fighting the choke, what is left other than you going unconscious? So I kind of feel like it was not like he was just tugging and he stopped it. He had stopped defending, and so it was a matter of seconds.
I mean, I kind of agree with Jeff. At first, I was doing the live blog for that fight over at MMAfighting.com, and literally my last sentence was, I think this is the worst stoppage I've ever seen.
Wow.
Just because, at first glance, they let go of the choke and Michael Chiesa springs back up and it's like, whoa, what just happened? But then looking at the replay again, and I saw it several times, the hand stopped fighting. And Yamasaki, he's been around for a while, so he might have recognized that. And I think that's actually not the worst stoppage. I think, you could make an argument that he looked out or he was on its way out. I've been grappling for about 6 years now, and I remember my first tournament, shot a double on a guy, put me in a guillotine, and the first thing I felt, I could breathe. It was a blood choke with 100%. My fingertips were getting numb, and then my legs were getting numb. And then I tried to tap, and I couldn't tap, and I went out. I feel like Michael Chiesa was right at that verge. He was still conscious, but he was right about to go out.
But don't you feel like he was maybe like a second away? And we've seen enough crazy things in this sport to where you can't assume. See, you brought up something interesting, that Yamasaki has been accused of letting fights go a little too long. This, to me, screams of a guy who is short on confidence and is afraid of letting something go too long. So now he's trigger happy, and now in sort of being so self-conscious, he actually stopped something too early.
I agree with you, but I also feel as though
in himself.
I agree with you, but I feel as though the criticism of him is way more than it needs to be.
For this particular fight, or in general?
Well, for this one, because this was not an example of Chiesa was escaping that choke right, and all of a sudden the fight was over before he got that chance to escape. This was a fight where he had stopped defending himself. And whenever I'm wondering about refereeing, I always go on Twitter and I go to John McCarthy's Twitter feed because people always ask him questions and he tends to answer. And he did not criticize Yamasaki directly, but what he said was the 3 ways that we stop a fight is if a guy taps, if a guy goes unconscious, or a person is injured of some sort. He did not say anything beyond that. But someone then asked him, well, what about, we sometimes say you're not defending yourself intelligently. And he didn't really weigh in on that. I really wanted to hear that, because is that a possibility? You could argue that Chiesa was not defending himself intelligently. If this were striking, if Lee were like pounding on him and Chiesa was just doing this, the referee would have stopped the fight because he was not defending himself intelligently. So, I'm wondering what the difference is between that and a guy just lying there with his arms out, no longer defending, trying to hand fight or defend the choke. And I know that it was wrong, and I know that it was not the right call, but I feel as though it was a kind of a slim error. I don't feel like this was anywhere near the worst stoppage. The worst short stoppage. I mean, there are stoppages where a guy waited too long, and Yamasaki has been guilty of some of those. But there also have been fights where somebody, gets knocked down, the referee jumps in, and the guy clearly was not concussed. This was not like that. This was one where I think, as you even said, we were a second away from that thing ending.
Also, Lee looked pretty dominant, So it's not like, he came back and then he got a choke and it wasn't like that. He looked pretty dominant. I think we know who won that fight.
Shouldn't Yamasaki, at least make an effort to speak to Chiesa he didn't do any of that. He didn't do any of that.
There's certain things he could have done. We've seen a number of times in fights, refs grab the hand, lift it up and drop it. If it drops, then he's out.
That's in pro wrestling they do that.
No, 3 times in pro wrestling.
That's right, exactly. I want to switch the narrative if we're going to talk about referees. Earlier that night, when BJ Penn was fighting and looking pretty ordinary, I thought that Kevin McDonald, who was the ref in that fight, did a really nice job toward the end of that fight. He was, if you went back and looked at that replay, he was hovering. As BJ was kind of getting, knocked around the cage, there was, you were waiting for Seaver to land that one blow that was going to really end it, and he never quite did. He wasn't accurate enough to do it, but McDonald was hovering so that he could pounce at a moment's notice, and you knew that there were seconds left in the fight, and I think out of respect for a veteran, for a legend of the sport, he kind of hovered there and did not pounce prematurely. He did not, even though BJ was putting up no fight toward the end of that fight, he didn't pounce. He sort of, basically let the guy, go out on his feet or leave the fight on his feet, make it to the final horn, and maybe the final horn of his career. I don't know. But I kind of, I took that as a positive sign of refereeing.
I'm just so tired of seeing referees, especially the top guys. I mean, Yamasaki has been doing this for well over a decade, not trusting themselves. Like when you're an MMA referee, more so I think than boxing or any other sport, it's so subjective, right? And you really have to be on top of your game. And it's clear, like we've seen this in the past with guys like Mergliata, we've seen this with Mazzagatti. It's like you could tell when they go in and then they go out. Eva Levine has done this as well. You need to be sure of yourself, and it just screamed to me like, why did you jump in there? You couldn't have waited one more second. You couldn't have seen if he tapped. Like you got to give the guy the benefit of the doubt. He's just been training all this time for a fight. Why did you jump in there? And why aren't you addressing it? Like in boxing a couple of weeks ago, the card that Andre Ward fought Sergey Kovalev for the second time on, there was an issue about a fight, a punch being landed after the bell. And then they interviewed Bob Bennett, Jim Lampley and Kellerman and stuff. Like, it's so transparent. Get the mic in front of the guy and make him answer for himself. He needs to, you have to explain your actions at some point. You are not immune to that just because you are a referee. And then, to have Dana White go on Instagram and say this guy is the worst, well, guess what? The UFC many times assigns Yamasaki to events where they're the commission. The UFC can tell Oklahoma City, trust me, the UFC can tell Oklahoma City all they want because they're making more money for that commission with one event than they're probably making the entire year. They could say, don't bring Yamasaki. And I know there is not a great abundance of referees in MMA, but don't give me this like, oh, we're washing our hands and this guy sucks. You can do a better job as the leading promotion in educating, in developing, in picking the right people for the job.
Referee has 2 jobs in there. One is to make sure the fight goes to the conclusion that is just, that the right person wins the fight, there's no fouls and all that stuff. And the second one is to protect the fighters. In the past, Yamasaki has let fights go too long. I'm going to be much more critical of a referee who lets a fighter go 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds too long than one who stops a fight short. I think it's well, of course, but people make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes.
But how many mistakes? And then you get to ref the freaking major leagues of MMA. You know what I mean?
I would like to add, he almost has the thresholds backwards because I feel like with chokes you can let those go on a little longer.
Yes.
Nothing's bad. I mean, sure, it's not healthy to be choked out, but I mean, it's not as bad as taking a few extra seconds of hard punches to the head while you're out. So I feel like he's got the thresholds mixed up. I feel like we can let chokes go.
Absolutely. Like in the NBA. The guys who referee the finals, like they've made it through an entire season and there's sort of a process. The best make it to the biggest stage. in our sport, it's the Wild West. It's like whoever's available. You may not be qualified, whatever. You may have had a horrible year, but hey, let's main event the main event. Let's referee the main event of a UFC card. It's backwards. It shouldn't work that way. And the crime in all of this is that we should just be talking about Kevin Lee, because all signs point to the fact that he was en route to winning that fight. But now there's this little thing attached, and I don't know about you guys, but I don't necessarily want to see the rematch. It sounds like they want to do Khabib versus Ferguson, and that makes all the sense in the world. And so you wonder what's next for Lee. Do they do this rematch? I don't really care to hear another 6 months of like mom stuff back and forth and press conference footage. Do you guys agree? Or
They settled it. I mean, we saw who was the better man that night in that cage.
Despite the sort of inconclusive.
I mean, yeah, I'm just not as outraged by the slightly early stoppage that a lot of other people are. I really am not.
All right.
I would say, though, I agree, you know, as a fan and as somebody that covers the sport, you know, I don't want to see another 6 months of that. But for the health of the division, of the sport, maybe a rematch isn't too bad. It extends Kevin Lee's, you know, shelf life, because or else he's going to go on fighting, I don't know, maybe any other top contenders, Edson Barbosa, whoever. And, you know, the top is clogged up. We might think Conor McGregor comes back in December, but we're not sure. And it's going to happen what happens at middleweight, that, you know, the top contenders are just going to keep fighting each other, and someone's got to lose. So, you know, by giving the rematch, it extends his, you know, his shelf life, per se, a little longer. And, you know.
I like the Barbosa idea.
I'd rather see Kevin Lee move on to the next. I mean, he won this fight.
Yeah.
He won this fight. I don't see. I feel as though you are punishing Kevin Lee by making him fight this, making him do this again.
Okay.
It was, you know, it was kind of like, you know, when Nate Diaz chokes out Conor McGregor, and then basically, you know, he has to fight him again. Well, of course, he gets well compensated for it.
And
he gets a ton of money. He gets a ton of money for doing that. But he pretty much had no choice, because McGregor was a guy who, you know, had all the sway. This is a different situation. This is a guy, you know, that doesn't have that kind of power. I just don't think you need to make that fight again.
Let me ask you,
for example, let's say if he were to go on and fight Edson Barbosa, 100% he would be deserved of a title shot, right?
After.
If he were to get past Edson Barbosa. But is he going to get it with, you know, considering that Ferguson is on top, you know, Khabib is also up there. He's going to have to fight maybe one more time after that, or maybe 2 times. And then there's a risk there for a loss, and then you'll lose that potential title fighter or whatever it is.
Well, the thing about the lightweight division right now, it feels kind of like it's being run like a boxing division, in the sense that if Conor comes back, he's probably going to get to choose who he fights, right? I mean, they're not going to be able to tell him this is the #1 contender. So if he comes back, let's say he comes back December 30th and says, I want to fight Nate. Nate's going to get that title shot. You know, the UFC...
John thinks he's the best lightweight.
You know what I'm saying? Like Sean Shelby's not going to be able to say to Conor, like, hey, we want you to fight Khabib. And I don't know, call me crazy, but I'm not buying just yet that Conor, as Dana White told MMA Junkie yesterday, wants to fight Khabib in Russia. That just, I don't know. That one makes no sense whatsoever, but we'll
You might have said it.
We'll run with it for now. I think it builds up his aura and you know, the story of Conor McGregor fighting anyone, anytime, any place. What did you guys think of the Kevin Lee, Tony Ferguson back and forth on FS1? How did you feel about that one?
I think that made a potential fight right there. I thought it was good.
After that, I kind of wanted to see that fight, more so than the Khabib fight, even though they have this long history.
Tony Ferguson wanted to say something so bad, but he was playing this analyst role, and he's just like, you know, I'm proud of you, you know, good job, whatever it is. But you can tell he was getting irritated by what Kevin Lee was saying.
Well, it's kind of funny. Here's Kevin Lee saying, you know, why don't you get some real journalists out there? And this is like on Fox Sports, which like a couple days later fires all of its real journalists.
I think a day later.
It was like, you know, maybe Kevin Lee's, you know, knew some things we didn't know.
No, but see, you mentioned an interesting point, because I felt, so when here's some insight. When I used to work for FS1 and do those shows and UFC 10 and all that stuff, it used to really bother me, and I openly said it, and I got in some heat for it, that I would be at the event and they wouldn't let me interview the main event winner. So I'm sitting there for 7 hours backstage, hardly doing anything. The cherry on top is to interview Kevin Lee in this situation. But they love to do this talk back with the studio. You don't see this in the NBA. Like when LeBron James wins a big game on TNT, you know, the sideline reporter interviews LeBron James. They don't have him interview with Charles Barkley and Kenny Smith. Anyway, they love to have this thing where they put a contender or someone in the division, the champion, in the studio to play analysts. Well, these guys aren't used to playing analysts, so to me, it kind of felt disrespectful towards Kevin Lee, because here's Tony Ferguson playing analyst, but then getting his feathers ruffled, and then using this opportunity as a chance to essentially belittle Kevin and say, yeah, you're not quite on my level just yet. But like, no, are you playing analyst? Are you being as neutral as possible? Are you being unbiased? Or are you using the power that you have, via the studio and the airtime on Fox to essentially just put down a guy who won the biggest fight of his life? You can't have both. You can't wear both hats, in my opinion.
I think I understand where you're coming from, but I actually thought it was a little bit almost the opposite in a sense that before Kevin Lee came on, Ferguson was speaking in pretty glowing terms about Kevin Lee's performance. He said a lot of very positive things and complimentary things about him. And then all of a sudden, Lee comes on, and the first words out of his mouth essentially were kind of dissing Ferguson. So now Ferguson basically has to
respond.
Either, he actually even continued to say some positive things about his performance, but the more vitriol that came his way, eventually he had to turn it around. So, I mean, I don't feel like Ferguson was the one who instigated that. I feel like he was kind of responding. But it does support the point you're making, which is, and it kind of supports the point that Kevin Lee was making, having like real journalists, having people who are actual analysts there who don't have a stake in it. That really would be, that would be a better
Maybe
scenario
they just
there.
remove the contender from those interviews.
But I think that they,
then
I
you
think
lose
they,
that moment.
But I think they have him there for that reason. There's a reason why Tony Ferguson was in the studio on that particular night for those particular fights.
I think maybe they should do a journalist, ask him some questions, let him cut a few promos, and then it's like, whoa, would this is the guy on top. Do you have anything to say to this?
Yeah.
But like for Tony Ferguson, and they've done this 1,000 times, to sit there and be like, so Kevin, tell me about that move. It's just like, it comes across as so fake. He doesn't want to ask him questions. Like, this is a guy who's trying to steal money and food and fame off his play, right? Like they're gonna fight each other. They're actually going to punch each other in the face. It almost takes away from like the sporting aspect if one day you put on a suit and you're like, so tell me about the time. Like when they had Dominic Cruz ask Cody Garbrandt questions 2 months after. Like, no, these guys don't like each other. We just saw them going back and forth and making fun of their dads and all this stuff. We can't forget that.
But this is what you get when you have active athletes, active fighters working in the studio.
Yeah.
In other sports, you've got former. Like in the NBA, the NBA coverage, you've got former players, NFL, former players. You don't have like, some guy who's competing against, and fighting is even different to a whole other level because there's all this intimidation and all that going on. So you're not going to have like, I don't know, like LeBron talking to Kevin Durant if LeBron hadn't made the finals or something, like
Kevin, tell me about that shot.
Or like Russell Westbrook. Russell Westbrook was not in the finals. They don't have him interview. So I think that's a whole different thing. It's even, it gets worse when these guys were in the same weight class. But even when they're not, even when it was, say, Bisping interviewing, Woodley or something, these are guys that are one weight class apart, and there's always the possibility they could get it on. And they even talked about that. So I think that this whole idea of having active fighters doing this job, is fraught with all kinds of, bad possibilities.
Let me ask you guys about BJ Penn. You mentioned him briefly. We saw this coming a mile away. I mean, it's kind of been this gradual thing with him. With some fighters, like with Fedor, I feel like he gets knocked down, it's like, and then he keeps getting knocked out. With like BJ's this gradual thing, and you can see it coming a mile away, and you don't want to see it, but you're still kind of interested in him because of what he means to the sport, and people are so loyal to him, and so you can't help but look away. But it's just, it hurts to watch. And this is by far the worst loss of his career, to lose to Dennis Siver at Siver's current stage of his career. I mean, it's tough to find someone beneath Siver at this juncture unless you bring in a guy who's like 0-1. What were you guys thinking? What were you feeling as you were watching that? Because important to note, second round, he did have his best moment that he's had in years, but the entire picture was not a very pretty one. So afterwards, when it was all done, what did you think? Is that it? Like, absolutely end it? Did he show some signs of brilliance? What do you say now?
I mean, he had that little moment in the second round, as you pointed out, and when he didn't get the finish, there was a part of me that during the break between the rounds, I thought, okay, well, Siver clearly won that first one, and BJ with that comeback won the second one. Now they're going to come out and we're going to see what BJ's got left, and then we did. We saw a guy who, did he throw a punch in the third round? I mean, he basically was like the Walking Dead out there for that last round. and it was really sad. I mean, it was, and I think you bring up a good point. I mean, I was already prepared for the sadness because I had already watched Fedor the night before, but this was kind of an extended sadness. It was like watching the slow demise of somebody, and with all these guys, the Fedors, the BJ Penns, we could throw Wanderlei Silva into there.
Johnny Hendricks. It felt like it was a very sad weekend in many respects.
There was a lot of, it was, you know what it was? It was kind of a weird thing, like that it's very hard to be graceful leaving a sport, and it's very hard to be graceful entering a sport. Aaron Pico, the much ballyhooed debutante, gets choked out in 24 seconds. So there's this whole like, how do you get in? How do you get out? It's a really tough thing.
Great point.
I think that final round in BJ fight was the one that was sort of telling, because the first round he didn't do too well. Sear won it, but then the second round he came back, and if you would have won the third round, maybe you could have been like, all right, maybe he can stick around. There's an argument there, but if you can't fight for more than 10 minutes, I think this is the end for BJ.
Okay, but so what does the UFC do now? Do they cut him? Someone else is going to sign him. It's clear that he wants to keep fighting,
I have a hard time seeing Bellator picking him up, and I have a hard time seeing BJ Penn fight anywhere else, to be honest.
You don't think he goes to Japan? You don't think, Ryzen would be interested in him with his background? Rich Chow is a longtime friend of his, and he's the matchmaker for Bellator. Like, I think he has options.
But I feel like as a friend, I mean, BJ did not look good. And if Bellator does sign him and put him in a card, I think, they've made some questionable calls as far as like signing some legends, but not enough for people to be like, okay, what are you doing?
Yeah.
With BJ Penn, I feel like people will start questioning, okay, is this Legends division a really good idea? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
So I think with BJ Penn, because like Tito Ortiz, we talk about it like, for example, a shot fighter. Tito Ortiz, perhaps, in his older stages, wasn't doing so well, but he was always active. I mean, till the very end, he was always swinging. He had some level of activity. BJ Penn just third round completely, closed shop.
He looks like a shot fighter, right?
100%. And
it's sad. It hurts my heart to see him like that.
And it's dangerous for his health.
It is.
He was fighting Dennis Sear, but look what would have happened with Yair. He took a bad beating there. So I don't see him fighting anywhere else. I don't see Bellator picking him up, and even Ryzen maybe. But
what do you do with a fighter who clearly doesn't want to say goodbye, but should say goodbye, and doesn't how do you? Because the UFC is a business, like they're not caretakers, right? So I understand where they're coming from. If they feel like they can make money off BJ, if they want to give him an opportunity, fine. But at some point, you gotta kind of wash your hands. But is washing your hands enough? Do they owe it to a legend who helped build the sport to do something? I know these jobs aren't around, but to put him in some kind of situation to where his transition out of the sport is an easier one than the last time he left, because the last time it did not go very well.
Well, I just want to say that I wish that Danny was the commissioner of MMA, because everything you said that would be the compassionate way to move on. But I don't know that there is a compassionate way to move on. For a while, Dana White was taking care of his buddies like Chuck Liddell and Matt Hughes, and hope Matt Hughes wishing him well with his recovery from his horrible accident. But that went away with the new ownership. So that's not an option for BJ Penn. One of the things I thought about, and I think I'm trying to think who it is. Is it Bisping? A couple of those guys have some of those UFC gyms.
BJ has one.
Why not sort of sink more revenue into those situations? Do something so that to draw more attention to those. Give these guys something that's going to be the next step. Because if you just cut BJ Penn, I kind of disagree with you. I think that Bellator would be at his doorstep with a contract in mere seconds, and then
they're talking to Chuck Liddell,
right? I think
Chuck Liddell's been out for a really long time.
I know, but he was getting knocked out cold.
Yeah. So, I don't think that just cutting him and saying, well, we're done. We're not going to make money off you anymore, so we don't want to do this anymore with you. That's one, at least that would keep him from fighting the killers on the UFC, but I think he's going to find killers somewhere else to fight. And, BJ Penn is a fighter. He wants to fight. Well, what's his next step? Hopefully, when he has one of these gyms, sink some money into it, get more publicity around it, get more students in there, build the clientele for him, help him take that next step.
Go ahead.
You talk about a promotion sort of setting a step for guys to retire, an easier step, but I don't think there's any easier step. That's why fighters keep coming back, getting the itch. There's no easier step there's nothing to replace fighting. I think BJ's a natural fighter. That's what he wants to do. A gym job, sure, it will help, but I don't think it'll fully replace his his itch.
It's a tough thing because, again, there is no fighter association. There's no retired fighters association. In other sports, if you play for X amount of years, usually around 10, there's a pension afterwards. There's none of that. And I know the fight game is different, and it's a lot more cruel, and it's harder to say goodbye, and the fall from grace is just a very extreme one. But you just wish that maybe the gold standard in our sport had some kind of system in place. Like, you look at that Courtney Casey situation, right? Courtney Casey could have been left on an island all by herself, but Jeff Nowitzki, UFC, USADA, to their credit, fought for her, paid all her dues as far as fighting this, this test failure, if you will, with Texas, and did everything, had her back, and that to me was like, they should be commended for that. I mean, that was an amazing thing. That's something that an association would normally do, but there isn't one. And in the past, if there wasn't USADA, if there wasn't Jeff Nowitzki, she would be left on an island all by herself to figure this out, and maybe she doesn't figure it out. So that's great. So I just wish, and I know it's naive and it's idealistic, but with guys like BJ, if there was a way to gracefully let them go out, and maybe it's the gym, and maybe he's refusing that, and maybe he's, to blame here for the most part. Like, maybe they tried to say goodbye and he just is knocking on their door too much. It's hard to fully verbalize, but it hurts the heart to watch a legend who was so dominant. I remember watching him at UFC 107 cage side against Diego Sanchez in Memphis and thinking, this guy is the best fighter in the world. And that wasn't that long ago. And so to see this fall from grace is painful.
Well, all that post-fight stuff or post-career stuff you're talking about that exists for athletes in other sports didn't exist for them at one point.
Sure.
So, the MMA is still a young sport. It's still developing. It's still trying to find out where, how the fighters or how the athletes are going to create something for their betterment, as collectively. And I mean, we've seen, associations, unions, whatever you want to call them, pop up, and nothing seems to have gotten much traction. But other sports, the same thing. I mean, I was just talking to someone the other day about Curt Flood and in baseball and the reserve clause and all that stuff. That was only 1969. Think about all the years that baseball existed before 1969, where players had no ability to move from one place to another. Now, all you hear about, as soon as the World Series is over, all you hear about is what free agent's going to sign where, and how many millions of dollars this guy's going to make or that guy's going to make. These developments take some time, and I think MMA just hasn't quite developed to that point yet.
So it was a very busy weekend last weekend in MMA. UFC Sunday night, Bellator at MSG Saturday. You guys watched it on television. I was there, so I'm very curious to get your perspective. Overall, from a TV viewer perspective, what grade would you give this event? Like, this was Bellator's, this was a big deal. This was the biggest night in their history. This was their best card. It was their deepest card, probably their most expensive card in the biggest venue possible for them in North America. When you clicked the TV off after watching it for 6 or so hours, what did you think?
I'm not sure about a grade. I certainly wasn't an A+ or an A, but it was certainly a very strong passing grade. I liked it a lot. I enjoyed it. I thought. I hadn't even thought about it that much, but the signing of Mauro Ranallo and Mike Goldberg as announcers, it struck me as soon as I was watching the stuff that was on Bellator.com. So it wasn't even the Spike stuff yet, and I was actually had it on while I was doing some other work, and I'm listening to it, and I'm hearing Goldberg's voice, and it just sounds so familiar.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And I thought, this is really a smart move, because there are so many people who. You just associate whatever sport you're in. You associate old-time boxing with Howard Cosell. You associate with different people with the way they sound, with certain voices. And I love the announcers that the UFC has now. Anik does a great job. But Goldberg's a guy that was there for a long time, and his. When you started hearing him announcing the Bellator stuff, I thought it really worked well. And then when it moved on to Mauro is. He probably is the greatest combat sports announcer of anybody, but he's at his best when some kind of crazy thing happens. When something insane happens, and that's what happened. Some of the fights that he was handling. I thought that the announcing part of it was really good. I mean, there were a lot of other things we could talk about, but just thinking about it from the sound that I was getting off my TV, I was all over it.
The quality was, because when you watch a UFC event, then you watch a Bellator event, you can kind of tell there's a difference between the two in styles and also in quality. But this time around, sure, there was a difference, but I feel like Mike Goldberg, filled that gap in a lot. For a second, I'm like, wait, you know, if somebody's a casual and perhaps can't, you know, distinguish, you know, they just know cage fighting, and they watch the Bellator fights, they might kind of mix it up with the UFC just because of that voice. And it was very, it was very similar to the UFC because of Mike Goldberg. And I think, you know, that improved the quality a lot. Plus, you know, it was a big show and they invested a lot. And I thought the TV experience was good. Yeah.
And I thought the fights kind of gave them a lot of the different elements of drama that they needed. I mean, the Aaron Pico upset was, you know, you could say it maybe derailed this guy a little bit, but, you know, it just makes his next outing even more interesting. And if he'd gone out there and beaten, you know, Zach Freeman was a guy that I had never seen fight before. I know that he had some fights before that, but he was not a name that I recognized. If he goes out and beats that guy in his debut, okay, so he's 1-0 and he beats some guy that you'd never heard of. So he goes out there and loses, and first of all, Freeman looked really good in those 24 seconds or so. So now you've got another guy that may have some potential in Bellator. And then the next time Pico goes out, you know, he's fighting two guys. He's fighting the guy across the cage, and he's also fighting himself, trying to making up for what he didn't do in his debut. So you had that. Then you had, you know, Michael Chandler getting injured in the middle of the fight. So now a guy who was a huge underdog is the champion. And you had, Lima fighting a guy an import from the UFC, and everybody was thinking, okay, these UFC guys are going to come over and take over. Well, he didn't. You know, and then, then the double knockdown in the Fedor Mitrione fight. There was a lot of little twists and turns. And Gallagher, James Gallagher. I mean,
I thought he had the breakout performance of the night. Like, he came across as a star in the making.
Yeah.
I mean, to do that to Machida, to walk up to him the way he did in the intros, to finish, to get that sort of reception from the MSG crowd. Let me ask you guys this, because I feel like sometimes, especially on this show, and I'm at fault in this regard as well. Like, we worry so much about, okay, what does this mean for the promotion, for Bellator? Was this good? But from a fan perspective, let's just leave the business side of things on the sidelines. Let's just forget about Bellator for a second. If you're a fan who sat down on Saturday night and said, okay, I'm going to pay $50. We don't know how many of those people are out there. We know it did very well, million or so viewers on Spike. We don't know the pay-per-view buys, and we'll never know for sure, probably. But if you paid $50 for that crazy card, regardless of if Pico won or what happened to Chandler, how was that not entertaining? Like, how did you not get your money's worth? You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like the main thing that you want when you buy a pay-per-view, especially in this day and age, when you're asked to pay for so much, is unpredictability, right? You don't want to. That was the knock on Coker back in the day in Strikeforce. Mismatches. Oh, we always know who's going to win. Pico going in there and getting starched in 20-something seconds. Chandler fighting on a leg and dropping Freeman, the double knockdown. You kind of got a lot of entertainment. So that alone makes me feel like it was a great night for Bellator. Now, if you want to say for Bellator was bad because the Golden Boy lost, because Chandler had this sort of inconclusive fight and it was a little bit controversial, and then you had that moment with the stool, and because Fedor gets knocked out brutally and there's not much to do with him now, and maybe Chael Vanderlei, didn't live up to, who knows. But I feel like if you're a fan, you kind of got your money's worth there. It's hard to be disappointed, as kooky as the whole thing was.
Yeah, I don't think any of the things you pointed out as possible drawbacks, I don't think any of them was a drawback, really. I thought, first of all, Chael and Vanderlei, it was, there's always the possibility when you see a guy like Vanderlei Silva who hasn't been in the cage, like 5 years?
4
years. That it's going to be a total embarrassment. Well, it was not a total embarrassment. It was, it wasn't the most competitive fight. Sonnen just, basically manhandled him a bit, but it was a passable fight. It was not horrible, and
it was actually good that it was 3 rounds, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. And I realize that I'm setting the bar low when I'm saying this fight was not horrible, so that's a good thing. But it had the potential of when you're pitting guys like that at that level, and you're pitting them in the main event, there is always the possibility you're going to get a totally embarrassing event. And Bellator certainly knows all about that, because they have put on some pretty embarrassing main events in their day. This was not one of them. And the fight, the Mitrione fight, the double knockdown, that's a memorable thing. People will be talking about that. Yeah. And then you get the actual knockout. I mean, and then of course, Mitrione, Be Still My Heart, he puts on his Giants jersey. I mean, I love that. A little tear came out when I saw that. I mean, I thought that it was a good night. I mean, Michael Chandler will have his moment to come back.
I actually kind of feel like his stock went up after that. Even though he lost the belt.
Aaron Pico will have his moment. These guys they'll have their chance to come back. It's not none of these guys. Their stories are not over. I think it just perpetuated some of their stories and created new ones. I thought it was not just the pay-per-view. I thought the Spike part of it was really good. I mean, you mentioned Gallagher. I mean, I think all the way through that was a night that was good for Bellator.
I think the pay-per-view, like if you're just a fan and you're like, okay, watch this, it was entertaining. The worst thing you can have is boring decisions, and there wasn't much of that in the pay-per-view. And there was turn of events, exciting bouts, with the Fedor and Mitrione. So just from an entertainment point, I think it was a very good night for Bellator, because the worst thing you can have is boring decisions, and then whoever buys the pay-per-view is like, I'm not going to buy a Bellator pay-per-view event.
Or controversy, right? People accuse them of fixing fights. Right. Things like that. You had none of that.
All these fights look competitive. Things that you'd think wouldn't happen happened, and it was a good card. So I think somebody that just buys that pay-per-view event might go, okay, I might buy another one. This was exciting. This was fun. Now for the promotion moving forward, then we can talk about how it was.
Okay, so let me ask you about Pico. Yeah. Did they make a massive blunder? In hindsight, was this a huge mistake to not only put him on pay-per-view in his debut, but to put him at MSG, massive stage against a guy who was 8-2 going in?
I mean, this is a guy that's competing internationally and representing, the U.S. for a while now, So I think, pressure, sure, there must be some, because it's novelty, it's new for him, but I don't think that was a big deal. I think the opponent was a big deal.
Yeah.
This guy was obviously, Zach Freeman. He was 8-2. We know 10 fights is a lot, compared
just fought for RFA belt.
100%. So I think they should have matched him up against, somebody more winnable, perhaps. This guy was game. And a lot of people are saying afterwards, like, okay, well, it wasn't that bad, because now you got Zach Freeman, a new player in the game. But the guy's 33 years old.
Sure.
He might have only a couple of years left in him. And, he was also in his post-fight interviews, he was a very nice guy. And, he wasn't out there making bold statements. I'm out here to beat every Bellator guy.
He was kind of making bold statements towards the media more so than anything. He was like, none of you guys wanted to talk to me. I'm not talking to any of you, which is kind of weird.
So I think they perhaps blew it, matching him up against Zach Freeman.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't feel like putting a guy in his debut in a gimme fight would be a better scenario. I think putting him in against a guy, this was not. In retrospect, the guy choked him out in 24 seconds. But going in, this was not a guy who seemed to be at a level above him.
But what's wrong? So Bellator is saying that Pico's team really wanted a tough opponent. Like, they wanted a big name. They wanted to expedite him. And like you said, he's been around. He's competed Olympics, all that stuff to make the Olympic team, but big stages internationally. But what's wrong with me? Because Coker even said to me, like, oh, had we put him in there against a guy who was 0-0, we would have gotten killed. I don't think so. 0-0 versus 0-0 is
or maybe just a couple fights in.
Yeah.
And, I think the promoter has a responsibility to be like, wait, no, hold on. Sure, you want some, let's meet in the middle.
Sure.
Let's do a guy then that's maybe, I don't know, 2-1 or 3-1, sort of meet in the middle as far as that. So I think by giving him Zach Freeman 8-2, I think, that was horrible. And it hurt Pico. I mean, somebody that's looking forward to, his debut and watches that, I think obviously Pico's young, he'll bounce back, but, it wasn't good.
We'll see what he's up to. We'll see what he's made of now. We will see if this kid is really special. And I don't think that last Saturday night told us that he's not special. It just told us that that he's young and he made a mistake. He's not the first guy that's run into a choke. We've seen some pretty legendary fighters. I mentioned Matt Hughes. I remember Matt Hughes lost 2 times to the same guy in mere seconds in a choke. So these things happen. I'm fine with the way they match him up, and we'll see what he does the next time. I don't think they'll. I'm sure they'll give him somebody who's not at a higher level, but I don't think they're going to give him somebody who's at a much lower level.
I would like to add that I do agree with that, but. The UFC has so many players involved. So, for example, let's take, the Sunday card. Let's say Michael Chiesa would have won. Obviously that shuts down Lee, but then you got another player, Michael Chiesa, and then you can promote him, and you can, sort of do things with him as far as promoting him, putting him in other fights, putting him in bright spots, and using him as a promotional figure. Now, for this, Bellator doesn't have as many players. They have very few big players. So they kind of got to take care of them, I feel like, a little bit more. So in this case, Aaron Pico was one of their bigger draws. I think perhaps they should have been a bit more.
Okay, so how about this silver lining? They don't have a lot of players. They just kind of gained one in Freeman, who was really just an opponent, right? Now there's a story there. Maybe you put him in there against another young stud, and you build him up as this kind of, legend killer. And then with Pico, had he just starched Freeman, okay, that would have been 1-0, move on to the next. Freeman was an opponent. We all expected him to win. But now it's part of his story, the comeback, the failure. This kid showed up to the press conference, and he didn't have to show up to the press. I mean, when does the fight, the second fight on the main card, show up, the loser of that fight, to the press conference? It's usually the main event, maybe the co-main event if it's a title fight. He had no business being there, but for whatever reason, he was there. I don't know if someone made him be there. I don't know if he wanted to be there, but he was there. And so I feel like now there's a real story behind him. Everyone loves a reclamation project.
Yeah.
Everyone loves a resurrection. Everyone loves a comeback. So again, I think in the moment, I looked at Scott Coker and I was like, oh gosh, this is a nightmare. And then right after that, Chandler, I thought broke his ankle. I thought something, thank God for him. It's just a nerve injury, and it seems like he'll be good to go in a couple of weeks. So that's, a massive bullet dodged. But in the moment, I was like, this is a real disaster for Bellator. But when I took a step back last few days, if they play their cards right here and they promote the comeback the right way for Pico, if they promote Freeman's, unlikely story from rags to riches, if you will, if they promote Chandler and Primus, and Chandler was fantastic on the show and the way he was talking, all is not lost. In the moment, it felt like a disaster, but now I kind of feel like there were some nice silver linings to come out of this.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't know. I also don't know what got Pico to that press conference, but I love that he was there. I mean, what is the most memorable moment in the great career of Conor McGregor? It's how he reacted the one time he didn't win, the one time that we saw him not win. That was one of the moments that, to me, sort of cemented him as the fighter that he is. I mean, I know it's crazy to think of a defeat as being a defining moment, but it really was for him, because it really showed what his self-belief was all about. So I'm going to, push that over into Aaron Pico's court and say the fact that he showed up afterward showed that he may have got choked out in the cage, but he wasn't defeated. He wasn't, this was not Ronda Rousey, getting knocked out and then disappearing for a year.
Sure.
And then getting knocked out again, and we haven't seen her, and she's on the Battle of the Network Stars or whatever. This was a guy who was much ballyhooed going into his debut. He failed in that debut pretty quickly and pretty miserably, and he stood up and was accounted for. And that, to me, that shows a lot.
And I think that also speaks volumes for his future and how he's going to come back. Because if you look at the guys that have, gone to a post-fight conference after a loss, Holly Holm, she's done to the media. Dominic Cruz. I mean, those guys have, come back.
Says something about their character.
Yeah, for sure. And it says something about, their comeback as well. I feel like, Pico will come back strong.
So overall, I thought it was a pretty darn successful. I mean, the ratings on Spike, tremendous for prelims and only 3 fights. Gallagher, Heather Hardy's win, and of course Ryan Bader is now their light heavyweight champion. And that wasn't the greatest fight of all time, sort of shades of their first fight. So I'm curious to see where they go from here. There is a lot of excitement, I have to say. I mean, the Spike TV president Kevin Kay and the head of sports John Slessor. I mean, you could tell there is some real optimism about Bellator, and I think for everyone involved, including the UFC, having a very solid number 2 is just good for the health of the business. So we'll see where they go from here. One last thing before we say goodbye. I just wanted to ask you guys quickly about the Francis Ngannou Junior Dos Santos fight. It was officially announced yesterday for the September 9th card in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Do we like this? I mean, JDS was just knocked out not that long ago by Stipe Miocic. Ngannou hits very hard, is on this roll. Do we like the fact that JDS is being put in this fight, perhaps maybe as a sacrificial lamb?
Well, a gatekeeper at least. I mean, whether
so you go from title contender, title fight to gatekeeper.
Gatekeeper. I mean, look, if JDS goes out and wins his fight, I don't think that he's going to turn around and get an immediate rematch for the title. So I think that the UFC is either counting on Ngannou to win the fight, or they're just looking at it as, well, the guy wasn't worthy of being a top contender if he can't beat JDS. I mean, I get what you're saying, what you're suggesting about the fact that he just got knocked out and now he's fighting against a guy who's got tremendous power. But you know what? This is the story of the heavyweight division. I mean, how many guys in the heavyweight division would you put him in with who don't have the power to knock him out?
Ngannou just has terrifying power.
But
Yeah.
I actually like this fight,
do?
and I think they played their cards right because the two sort of prospects that were sort of fueling that division and sort of building excitement is Derek Lewis and Francis Ngannou.
Yeah.
Derek Lewis just lost to Mark Hunt, and JDS is at a point where he's sure you can make cases that his chin has deteriorated a bit, but he's still not a guy, say like an Andrei Arlovsky, which has lost many fights, and people wonder, okay, well, Francis Ngannou beat Andrei Arlovsky. What does that really say?
Yeah.
I think JDS is still legit and still a legit figure. So if Francis Ngannou were to get through JDS, it legitimizes him. It raises him up to title contention, and now you got a really exciting prospect that could very well challenge for the title. Now that you got Derek Lewis, perhaps he has to pick up a few more wins before to get back in the conversation.
And that is the definition of a gatekeeper, right?
Yep, and the fight game's cruel. If I were JDS team, I don't like that matchup for him. But if we're talking about the sport and the promotion and the division itself, I think it's a great option. Build him up.
I prefer the term the litmus test. Not so much gatekeeper. I feel like gatekeeper is sort of a negative term.
Negative
the litmus test. Let's just see. This is
Negative
the toughest fight
whom?
of JDS.
Well, he's the guy guarding you. You can't if you can't beat me, you can't get to the champ. And
that is true.
and that says that
Usually
he's
gatekeeper is kind of in the middle as opposed to at the top.
Yeah.
Because I feel like if Ngannou wins, you can very well give him a title shot.
Yeah, sure. Back to what I was saying, JDS is legit. By no means he's perhaps, no disrespect to Che Congo, but he's not sort of in the middle of the division. No, by no means. He's still at the very top. Yeah. He's top 5.
Congo is a Bellator gatekeeper, let alone a UFC gatekeeper. That's a whole other level of gatekeeper for the heavyweight division.
He's definitely legit, and I think it's the best matchup that you can give Francis Ngannou to legitimize him and make him into a contender.
Yeah.
Still wondering what's up with Kane, because that's the one. I really want to see Stipe fight a healthy Kane. Who knows if we'll ever see that, but it's good to see Ngannou get back. It's a nice fight for the Canadian fans. By the way, we're actually, I don't want to say off next weekend because we're going to do an MMA Beat next weekend, but it's going to be on the road from Las Vegas. I will be there for UFC 213 and The Ultimate Fighter, also the Hall of Fame ceremony, which I'm very curious about on Thursday night. So we won't be in the studio, but we'll do one from Vegas with the crew that's over there, but I won't see you guys. So can you throw out a fight? Like there's 2 cards next weekend. Is there a fight that's really sticking out? Because I don't know if there's a surefire answer here. There's a couple of good ones, some diamonds in the rough.
Well, those title fights are the title fight, the main event title fight.
Nunes Shevchenko
is a tremendous fight, and so is that interim belt fight, the
Romero
Whittaker. But and obviously those are the highlight fights. But when I see Jim Miller's name on a fight card, I always want to see the guy fight. I mean, there's just something about the way that guy brings it. And Anthony Pettis says, I didn't realize, man, I was looking at his record, last 4 out of 5. I mean, I knew he'd been down, but I hadn't really added it all up to 4 losses out of 5 fights. But they're both guys that they're going to bring it. It's not a meaningful title contention fight, but it's a fight that I always like to watch because I love watching Jim Miller fight, and I like watching him walk out.
So that's your pick. Interesting. I like it.
Yeah.
Off the grid.
Why not?
What do you got?
I would go with Joel Romero versus
I like
Robert
the way you
Whittaker.
say that.
Romero,
That's because I couldn't say that. I would have said that one too, but I can't roll my R's like that.
Well, because I honestly think whoever wins that is the real champion, to be honest. We're looking at the best guy in the division.
Shots fired.
Joel Romero versus Robert Whittaker is for the number 1. Of course, Bisping's game fighting any of those guys. By no means I'm shutting down Bisping here, but I really do think those are the 2 best guys. This is not just some interim title fight made for any reason. This is a legit fight. We got 2 of the best middleweights going at it with very contrasting styles. You got a great wrestler who always finds a way to win, and he's just seems a freak athlete and just seems to find always a way to win somehow. And then you got Robert Whittaker, who came out of nowhere and beat Jacare, and all of a sudden he feels like a new fighter. He feels like a new player in that division.
What do you mean you're not shutting down Bisping? You're of course you are. You're saying these 2 guys.
Sure. No, I mean I could say he's still game fighting any of those guys, but I do think they're a notch above.
By the way, you just came from Miami, close to Miami, right? How big of a deal is Romero?
I mean, there's a lot of stories covering him around, and I wouldn't say he's a huge deal, but he's definitely known.
First Cuban champion he would be, right?
Yeah, first Cuban champion. Miami has a huge Cuban community,
right?
And that'd be huge if and not only does it apply to Cubans, but just Latin America in general. He speaks Spanish. It'd be a great story. Plus his story from defecting to Cuba.
Oh, it's crazy.
From Cuba,
he still hasn't been back. Hasn't seen his son in 11 years, who still lives there. He says he's
that's
waiting
a novel right there.
to win the belt. to go back and celebrate with his family now that he can go back. But it's an amazing story of going to Germany and the neck surgery and even the way he debuted in Strikeforce and it didn't start off well. The fact that in 2017, Yoel Romero was here, finally getting a chance to fight for any kind of belt, is pretty damn remarkable. I'm excited about the debut of Justin Gaethje. That feels like a long time coming, and that's a great fight. Also,
That's on the other card.
That's on the tough
It feels like it should be promoted more. Like it's kind of flying under the radar.
This is the constant battle that we have.
But those two top fights are just both dynamite. They're
Alistair Overeem and Fabricio Verdum is a very important fight.
Yeah.
Very important fight in the heavyweight division. Also, Mark Diakese has looked very good, a prospect at 155. So there's a lot to discuss next week. Like I said, we'll do a on-the-road edition of The Beat. Don't want to leave you hanging. Won't be in the studio. We'll be back in a couple weeks doing the regular show. But great job, guys. 3 deep. Who needs Luke and Chuck?
This guy.
comes
The
back.
Black Blazers.
Yes.
no
guns
hat,
blazing.
no beard, but we got the stash.
Got the stash. I like it very much. Great job and welcome back.
Thank you.
All right, we are done. We appreciate you watching. It's a relatively quiet weekend in MMA, but there is the inaugural Professional Fighters League event on NBCSN. That's from Daytona Beach. 4 fights on that card, and there's some big names: John Fitch, Jason High, Brian Foster. So if you're jonesing for some MMA action on Friday, I do believe there's also an LFA event. There's a 1FC event. There's always something going on. No UFC, no Bellator. UFC is back next week, and like I said, we'll talk about that from Las Vegas. For now, we shall say goodbye. For Jeff, for Danny, I am Ariel. Again, thanks so much for watching. Have a great weekend. Happy Canada Day, and we'll see you next week.
Oh, yeah.